there has been, I think, good, healthy discourse that came too little too late, but in the wake of the election, about the extent to which foreign spending has frustrated voters and kept voters at home. Democrats sort of spent the last few years framing one's feelings about Ukraine as either you're kind of with Putin or against Putin, not recognizing that while you can have ample and should have ample sympathy for what the people of Ukraine are going through, Americans domestically are wondering why these multi-billion-dollar aid packages can go out the door to Israel, go out the door to Ukraine, or go out the door to God knows whom. But there seems to be all of these limits on domestic spending, including alleviating domestic debt, whether it is student debt or medical debt or credit card debt or any other kind of debt. You brought this up, and I think this is a really important question to ask, which is what now happens when Donald Trump reoccupies the White House. You alluded to the fact that when these public loan forgiveness loans came to fruition and during the first Trump administration, they were not, in fact, forgiven, that there are all of these people who still should have had their loans forgiven, even under these kind of pre-existing policies, that still have not had their loans forgiven. Obviously, more and more people are going to come to the 10-year, the 25-year limit of their programs under the Trump administration. What can we expect to happen?
Wow. I think what the least we can expect is probably what happened in his first administration. I don't have any reason to believe Donald Trump has moved to the left on higher education. I'll make that claim. And so just to remind folks what happened, it was widespread denials. I mean, there were some wins under the Trump administration. A lot of that was like courts mandated them to do things. And it got to a point where it was like, okay, Secretary Betsy DeVos was like, fine, I will do this because a court told me to, and I maybe don't want to be held in contempt of court. We have this image I'll send it to you after Betsy DeVos signing some of our members' debt cancellation. She signed each slip by saying, with extreme displeasure. So gotta love Betsy for being so
whatever.
dramatic.
Cope, Betsy. Cope and mold.
Right.
All right. Okay.
So, I mean, we had a lot of improper denials. You know, we had servicers that were not responsive to borrowers. But to take us back to that moment of the throes of the student debt crisis, in 2019, a student loan borrower defaulted on their student loans every 30 seconds. So a million people defaulted on their student loans that in 2019 and every year until we paused student loans. And so that's exactly what we're about to go back into, which was sort of like 2019 version. And it's going to be really bad. And, you know, they're saying they don't want a Department of Education. I'm not exactly sure what that means. I can guess that it means privatizing things and increasing profit to things. And so at the least, what the Trump administration, his Department of Education is going to look like, which will probably be even crazier than his first administration, will be the first 4 years of his administration, which was disastrous, which meant that borrowers couldn't get in touch with the Department of Education. They were having all these types of punitive punishments, some of which they're experiencing now under the Biden administration since he has resumed student loan payments. And people are going to be in really bad situations. And, you know, we have to have conversations about what it means to go on strike or to use creative ways to find your loans being paused or to engage in different types of civil disobedience. You know, we can have that conversation. But for a lot of student loan borrowers, it means we're going to be in a really bad position. And we should be sober about that.
So what is happening to the folks who defaulted in 2017 or 2019, right up until the student debt moratorium? What are the implications of those defaults? What does that look like?
Yeah, you default on your loans. For some reason, you get like capitalized interest, which I don't know who came up with this. Maybe I'm sure someone listening does. But they're like, oh, you can't pay on your student loans. Why don't we increase your balance by combining your interest with your principal and make you pay interest on interest? So your balance capitalizes and then it shoots up. You have higher rates. You have people who are, when you default on your loans, It ranges from, there's people who have like lost their driver's license. There are people who have,
Wait, why do you lose your driver's license because you default on your loans?
I think it depends on the state, but there are all of these different consequences that are both federal and state level where it affects your credit or it affects, the way that your there's something really odd about student loans that is just uniquely punitive in a way that other debt types are. You can't
Mm,
discharge student loans in bankruptcy like you can with
thanks.
other household debt
Thanks,
types.
Biden.
Thanks,
Yeah.
thanks, Joe Biden. That was one of his fights. Um, um, with student loans, there's all these types of payment programs that don't actually work. You can't quite really negotiate like you can with other different debt types. Um, there's just something quite sinister about student loans, and I think that's why there's such a big call for canceling the debt. And I think a really important fact is a lot of these borrowers are older. So I think people think of student debt as like a young person's issue because I think when people think of student debtors, they're thinking of students.
Right.
Students are not necessarily student debtors, and student debtors are not necessarily people who have a college degree. 40% of people who have student debt don't have a degree. So a lot of people who have student
Say it
loans,
again. Say it again and loudly because this one drives me crazy. You said 40% of people who have student debt don't have a degree.
right, and that's increasing every day. And
So
so
these are people who didn't graduate, oftentimes because they couldn't afford to pay to finish. Do these also include people who might have gotten a degree from a trade school, or is that a different category of debtors?
what I'll at least say anecdotally, the data is pretty clear. People cannot afford, they get 2 or 3 years or 1 year, a semester into college, and like this is unaffordable. They drop out and they can't pay and they still owe student loans. Anecdotally, from like real people, we hear so much. They're like, I was in my sophomore year of college, my junior year of college. A parent got super sick. I had to take care of
Yeah.
them. So I dropped out of college to take care of a parent. I had a mental
Yeah.
health crisis. I was assaulted. X, Y, or Z happened on campus and they didn't
Yeah.
finish their education. Or, they started college. There's a $200, fee that for some reason was left out. They couldn't afford to pay it and like couldn't finish, that last semester or something like that. And so they literally, so many people have all of their credits, but because there's still like a small payment that they didn't make in the early 2000s, they just didn't finish their degree. And then they try to go
Yeah.
back and get it. And then the school's like, that $200 is now $2,000. And they're like, okay,
Yeah.
well, I already have a life and kids. So I just drop it. So 40% of people who have student loans don't have a degree. So you have people paying on student loans with a college diploma, technically level of education. That's what they're being paid in the workplace. So what I'm trying to say is there's all these unique situations in which renders student debtors uniquely unable to pay student loans, not just because the balance is high and not just because the interest is high and not just because we shouldn't rest on this commodified idea that a higher education degree will pay off, because that's not necessarily true. Nor
Right.
should we be thinking about higher education in that way. Um, but we just have a really punitive higher education system that checks you at every moment. And a really big thing that we have to underscore, this is a big reason why we were saying cancel student debt, is because there are just very, very blatant administrative errors. There are so many people who shouldn't have the debt that they have because of an administrative error. So there's a lot of those people who got student debt cancellation under the Biden administration for public service loan forgiveness. You're supposed to make 120 payments. They made 130 actually, or 170. And the Department of Education over the past couple of years didn't count certain payments for whatever reason. And so you have all of these people who are like, I literally just have an administrative error, whether they knew it or not. And those people face these types of economic consequences too. So this is the crisis that we had in 2019. And this is what we're going in back to, because we're going back to, the higher education system, people with student debt is kind of unique amongst the pandemic era policies because in some ways they didn't experience any assistance. So they got a pause, right? But no relief. And so people are going back to the situation that they were in. And for a lot of them, it's just worse. And for a lot of people, they actually pay down some of their debt in hopes that they would be able to get to the rest, but can't do that now. So this is the mess we're in.
Let's talk about the pause. I completely agree with you about needing to be very clear-eyed about um, what the Trump administration will bring and what the Trump administration brought last time. It is also true that this COVID era pause, it should not be attributed to Trump. Trump did not do this out of the benefit of the goodness of his heart. But the experience for many of us during COVID was that the pause that was implemented in 2020 was life-saving. It meant that during a time of high unemployment for so many Americans because of the shutdowns, that there was a $500, $1,000, $2,000 a month check that didn't have to go out of the door, draining your income or your savings. And it meant that because of the high interest rates that many of us experienced, depending on when you graduated from college, you were able to, for the first time, really take big bites out of the principal. If when you did become employed again, or when your financial situation did straighten up somewhat. For someone like me, who again, smallest violin, this enabled me fundamentally to pay off my loans. But for that pause, I would still be making these payments. But for that pause, I don't know that I would have started a podcast or tried to do anything entrepreneurial at a time post Bernie campaign when I was unemployed. I would have been rushing to find some 9-to-5 so that I could pay my $2,300 a month payments. That being said, the choice to restart the payments a year before an election, when so many other COVID era policies had expired or were set to expire, did seem like an incredible political own goal by the Biden administration. And if I recall this correctly, the student debt pause moratorium being lifted came as a kind of a negotiation around one of the debt ceiling discourses around midterms. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, so the Biden administration made a decision to say we're going to trade away this debt moratorium, which we have no obligation to lift, and which had constructively resolved, if only temporarily, resolved the student debt crisis. Because remember, the overarching theme, and again, correct me and push back against me if you think I'm mischaracterizing this, is that this is federally held debt. The whole reason that there is the ability for the Biden administration or any administration to cancel this debt is it's because it's debt the government is owed. It can say, hey, we're good, actually. We don't have to settle up just the way a pal who bought you dinner can. And that as long as they say you don't have to pay, the loans constructively don't have to exist. And so to the extent that people are now frustrated or feeling that their lives are very much worse off now than they were at the tail end of the Trump administration when their loans were on pause, it is a very conscious decision that was made by the Biden administration, which from my perspective makes it even more perverse that they would then go and try to brag about a very small number of people in the grand scheme of things getting their debt canceled when tens of millions of people now are experiencing for the first time since Trump was president, the hardship of having to pay those loans.
Let me tell you how conscious it was, because I remember, you know what? I remember this White House meeting that I was in because we said at that point, hey, you all, you can, and just to, make clear for listeners, there was a conversation about the debt ceiling. Do we raise it or what? Republicans were holding it hostage. Democrats had some leverage, but the Republicans were holding it hostage. And one of the concessions, there were two concessions. One was well, why don't we make it more difficult for poor people to get food? And then the other was, why don't we give away the student loan pause? And so this is in the summer. I can't remember the date, but it was before the Supreme Court in July of 2022 was going to announce their decision on Biden v. Nebraska. And we were like, hey, don't give away the student loan pause at all, but also don't give away the student loan pause before you know how the Supreme Court is going to rule on relief. What if you give away the student loan pause, which by the way, they were codifying their ability to do that. What if you give away the student loan pause and then the Supreme Court says you can't cancel student debt? You would be bargaining away student debtors. We met with the White House, we met with members of Congress. The White House said, we are really, really secure in the way that we've argued this case. And we think, we know that we are going to win this case and that people will get relief. And then people will get their relief. And just like we said from the top of this administration, loans are turning back on. We didn't say that we were going to keep loans on forever. And we were like, so you're literally rolling the dice. You're literally taking a chance. Like, have you all heard of Roe v. Wade? Have you heard of have you all heard of gerrymandering or money in politics? Like, the Supreme Court is not something we should roll the dice on. And they did. And they lost Biden v. Nebraska. And I think that had in part something to do with why they, took a second stab at canceling student debt. Like, oh man, they kind of got a point. We did really roll the dice on that. But they still, we could go on and on about the problems, and maybe we should, the problems that they had with their second attempt at student debt relief. But that is what happened. And that is why the pause turned back on. And that was a grave mistake. And I think it's so important, to your point, it's so important to understand. I don't think people realize there's so much discourse about, Kamala Harris losing and economics, identity politics, et cetera. Great conversations and some not great conversations. The pause ended in October of 2023, and there was a 1-year grace period. And so the 1-year grace period, which was sort of like the left got a small little win there, was basically, if you don't pay your student loans, if you miss a payment or choose not to make a payment, for 1 year, there will be no financial consequence. You won't have a ding on your credit. You won't slip into default. You won't have your Social Security check garnished, et cetera. And so we were like, okay, like, this really sucks, but we got a 1-year pause. And you know what? 1 year from now is October 2024. There's no way Democrats would let that happen 1 month before an election. Maybe they'll extend that 1-year grace period. They didn't extend it. And so October 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 17th, 23rd, 30th, millions of people had to pay a student loan payment. Like, as they're like paying a student loan payment as they're signing an absentee ballot. We were like, why are you putting people in this position? And that was a grave mistake. And I, for the life of me, don't know why they did that.
All right. That is I'm so glad that you laid it out like that, because it is malpractice of the highest order to have the first student loan payments with financial consequences attached if you fail to pay happen literally a month before an election.
I mean, why did they could have at the least had a 3-month extension? Well, January. We'll come back to it in January.
Right. So tell me about that decision. I mean, you were in there lobbying for this to come out differently, but did they not perceive the potential backlash that could come from the timing of it? I mean, frankly, even if it were a year in advance, even the whole point of it is that people were imagining their life under Trump, their life in 2016, their life in 2020 versus their life now. And that odious comparison could emerge regardless of when this happened. But this timing, it almost feels like if you're a Republican, you're like, yeah, like, let them, excellent. Let them think that they got this 1-year extension because this is going to be delicious for us. Were they really that myopic?
I think a couple things. One, there's a real clip somewhere of Jen Psaki. Folks remember that name multiple times, being like, turning student loan payments is our top priority. Like, they love to say that the first year, when Peter Doocy would ask what's happening with student loans, it was like their defense. Like, resuming payments is our top priority. We were like, one, stop saying that, even if it is. And two, don't make that your top priority. That doesn't make any sense. So I do think
why do you think they... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Exactly. The Department of Education, folks who make decisions there, and Joseph Biden wants to turn student loan payments back on. They think people should have to pay them back because they believe that we owe them for something. I think they have a deep commitment to forcing people to pay back those debts. I think that's genuinely why they wanted to turn student loan payments back on. I don't understand that.
That's so inconsistent with the idea of pushing, no matter how poorly, a student debt cancellation policy to begin with. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.